Ladies and gentlemen, the book is entitled The Inside Story of the Greatest Baseball Team Ever, the 1998 Yankees. Jack Curry is the author. He's a New York Times best-selling author, as a matter of fact. He's an analyst on Yes Network during the baseball season. Yankee fans, you see him every night on the pre and post game. Jack Curry, thank you so much for being my special guest tonight.
Mike, it's my pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for giving the book such a quick mention and putting it right up there in the camera. Authors love to see that, so I appreciate that.
Jack, you're no stranger to the New York Times bestseller list, but I would think, just like Yankee fans, beating the Red Sox never gets old. I would think your book, shooting up to, I mean, it really rocketed. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, it was released a month ago in bookstores. Jack, how satisfying is it to see that hard work pay off?
Well, Mike, it's really your ultimate goal as an author. You write the book and you want people to be interested in it because you've put so much into it. And sure, we all like to be acknowledged. We all like to be recognized. And I worked at the New York Times for 22 years, and I know how hard it is to get on that bestseller list. So to be able to have had 4 books now that have been on the New York Times bestseller, I feel very blessed. I've had a lot of people in my corner to help me out with that. The one thing I always tell people, though, Mike, is you work on the book, you write, you report, you research, you sit down and you put it all together. And then when the book is done, you've got to turn into P.T. Barnum. You've got to be the biggest promoter out there because you want people to hear about your book. So you have to make sure that you're a big time promoter.
Jack, this book sells itself. And ladies and gentlemen, I knew how busy Jack was, and I saw him making the rounds, and I saw him on MLB channel, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But you did a great job promoting the book, but quite frankly, the book sells itself. As soon as I saw 98 Yankees, I'm there. I lived it. I was, again, it's hard to believe that it's 25 years. That's why you wrote the book now, 25 years. And I knew you wouldn't let me down because I read your other books. When I looked at chapter 1, I said, he did it. He hit it out of the park. Because how do you tell the story about 1998, ladies and gentlemen? Jack starts talking about 1997. And you say, what? Okay. Well, Jack was 100% historically correct that the drive in 1998 started with a bitter loss, and Jack called chapter 1 Before Glory, Suffering. So Jack, it was not only the fact that you hit it historically correct, but you were there in the locker room in 97. Take us through that 1997 ALCS devastating loss. You were there.
Right, Mike. When the Yankees lose to Cleveland, walking around that clubhouse, there was so much misery and there was so much disappointment. And I had covered losing clubhouses before, but that one really stood out for me because since the Yankees won in 96, I think they thought they were on a magic carpet ride. Win in 97, keep this going. And they felt as if they had left something on the table. Joe Torre had a nonverbal meeting with them where he just sat in the middle of the clubhouse, kind of the wake on the season, the eulogy toward the season. George Steinbrenner patted everybody on the back and said, we're going to win it all next year. And at the time Steinbrenner said that, I thought that was just an owner saying what every owner probably feels he has to say. Well, Steinbrenner ended up being right, but you used the word, Mike, drive, commitment, focus. Torrey talked about how that 97 team, most of the guys were back, came into 98. We're not going to let that happen again. We're not going to be that close and leave something on the table again. And I do think that what happened in 97 was a huge motivation to the team being so successful in 98.
Jack, you were a writer for the New York Times on a national level. You were a beat writer first, and then at that moment in time, you were a national writer. I'm going to read, ladies and gentlemen, from page 27. Jack writes, one day after the Yankees lost to the Indians, I wrote this in the New York Times, and I'm quoting, but the Yankees should field a very talented team that contends again and might even improve if George Steinbrenner spruces up the roster by adding Robin Ventura at third or Chuck Knobloch at second. you know what? They might have been listening to you, because that's exactly what happened. And Jack, what I'd like to do is, this leads us into chapter 2. It's called The Pieces and the Puzzle, and the pieces of the puzzle. And when you look at it from a historical vantage point, this was Brian Cashman's first year as GM, and it's fascinating because there were three major acquisitions. One of them was Knobloch, one of them was Brocious, and the other one was El Duque. And we have to give Brian Cashman an enormous amount of credit, because interestingly enough, it was three different things. Actually, and I'd just like you to give the backstory just briefly on all three. But Knobloch was his first signing as GM. But prior to that, I believe that you mentioned that the Brocious deal was fascinating because he was still reporting to Bob Watson at the time. He was responsible for West Coast activity, including obviously the Oakland A's. You give credit, in the book, to a scout, and I'd like for you to talk about those two for a minute. Then we'll talk about El Duque.
Right. Bob Watson was still the general manager when the Scott Brocious trade was made, and the Yankees traded Kenny Rogers. And at the time, we all pretty much called it a salary dump. But you're right, Mike, in saying that Watson had given Cashman a lot of power. Had said, listen, there are about half the teams in the league. Why don't you deal with these teams? So Cashman had a relationship with Billy Beane. They were closer to being contemporaries. And there was a belief in the Yankee organization that Brocious could come in and at the very least be a versatile player, a guy who could play some strong defense. Cashman called him a gift from God in what he was able to do in providing so much. Ends up being the World Series MVP, hits 300, knocks in almost 100 runs. So sure, you have to trust your scouts sometime. And that's what Cashman did in that situation. And you're right, the first deal that he officially makes, but that was also in the works when Watson was still there, is Knobloch. And Mike, when you go back and look at who Knobloch was at the time, his career was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. And the Yankees really felt they needed a feisty gnat of a leadoff hitter, a guy who could go up there and see a lot of pitches. And that's who Knobloch was in 1998. He brought that kind of approach to that lineup.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll say it again. This is a must read. And again, as we record this, Father's Day is right around the corner. I can't think of a better gift for any dad, any Yankee fan, any baseball fan than this book. It's chock full of stories that you just didn't know about. And I'll give you a perfect example. El Duque, that was fascinating. Now, I'm going to say that I was, and still am, a huge Gene Michael fan. I believe he was the architect. And the thing is that in the book, Jack, you explained something that I was very happy to see, but I never really understood. El Duque, we knew that this guy was a sought after, free agent, so to speak, right? He's coming from Cuba, but I never realized why and how the Yankees had the inside track. You explained it, that Brian Cashman went out of his way to build a relationship with his agent, who at the previous to that was Mariano Rivera's agent.
Right, a little known story, and that's why I appreciate Brian Cashman giving the time that he gave me for this book. He told me gems like that. Joe Cubas, was representing Mariano Rivera. Gene Michael didn't want to deal with him because Gene Michael thought that Cubas had stolen Mariano as a client from another agent who Stick was friends with. Brian says, listen, we have to deal with all the player agents. Whether you like it or not, we've got to deal with these guys. So Brian had a lengthy conversation with Joe Cubas and did develop that relationship so that when he ends up being the agent who has El Duque, the Yankees did feel that they had some sort of advantage there. I think El Duque was always tilting toward the Yankees as well. I think that was a place that he wanted to try and play. But you're right, Mike. The fact that Cashman had that previous relationship with his agent, it obviously helped the Yankees when that situation arose.
Absolutely. And Jack, I use this expression for historical context. I say that when Brian Cashman stepped up, and again, this is something that you explain reluctantly. He really didn't want Bob Watson to step down. But I always called what Brian Cashman took over was the core four and a whole lot more, because it was not only Jeter and Mo and Andy and Georgie, but also Bernie Paulentino, and then Nelson and Stanton in the bullpen. Okay, but also it's rare for a GM to step into a position and inherit the manager, Joe Torre, right? Zimmer as the bench coach, and Mel Stoudemire. So and it's not fair to say he inherited because he was part of the organization. But having said that, you cannot take away the fact that those acquisitions, just those three, and there were more, but those three put them over the top to make them from what they were in 96, falling short in 97, and again, put them on a totally different level with those acquisitions that Brian Cashman had his fingerprints all over.
Yeah, I think you look at a team, and when a team is supposed to be very good or great, and then that team becomes extraordinary, you say to yourself, well, where were the overachievers? Where did you get contributions that perhaps you didn't expect? Now, in taking it in that direction, I'd actually push Knobloch off to the side and say he did what they expected. Brocious was definitely a gift from above. El Duque the same. And then the third one I would throw in there, Mike, is Shane Spencer and what he did in September and even into the playoffs. You need guys to come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and be great. And those three guys to me were the three from that 98 team. Brocious, El Duque, and Spencer, giving the Yankees way more than they would have expected if you asked them to make a prediction in spring training.
And Jack, just what we're explaining to some of the younger viewers that didn't live through it, you say, well, okay, makes perfect sense. This was a storybook. Not exactly, ladies and gentlemen. The team starts 1-4. George Steinbrenner gets on the phone and says to Brian Cashman, pack your bags, come back to New York. There was a team meeting. Could you tell our viewers briefly about that, Joe Torre and the team meeting?
Yeah, they started out 1-4. So before Game 6, Joe Torre had a meeting in Seattle. He wasn't happy with the way the team was playing. He opened up the floor for players to speak. David Cohn was very vocal, and Cohn was a big believer in finding a reason to hate your opponent, even if you have to manufacture it. But the Yankees didn't really have to manufacture it with Seattle. Those two teams didn't like each other. The Yankees felt that Lou Piniella always went out of his way to make sure that Paul O'Neill got a pitch under the chin. So after that meeting, Knobloch leads the game off with a home run. They beat Seattle. They actually go on to win 22 of their next 24, 64 of their next 80. So I kind of tongue-in-cheek call it one of the greatest meetings of all time because that team really soared after that. I think they probably would have soared anyway, Mike. That team was so talented. But Joe Torre let them know that first week in the season, hey, the way you're playing is unacceptable, and don't let something special get away from you. And they didn't. They were amazing for the rest of the way.
Jack, what I also loved about the book is just everything that you're saying, but you took the time to go the extra mile, to throw some things in. I'll give you a perfect example. Jason Varitek, you reached out for him, okay, a catcher for the Boston Red Sox. And I thought it was so poignant the way you paint the picture there, where he almost still to this day breaks into a cold sweat. And also, I loved the Homer Bush story with Joe Torre. Was this just organic, or did you go out of your way to throw in some different type of stuff?
I wanted to talk to Varitek. This is obviously a Yankee book, so the majority of the interviews are going to be from Yankees. But one thing about that team, Mike, and you know it well, is that they wore pitchers out. They destroyed pitchers. If they weren't hitting you, they were taking pitches to run up your pitch count and get you out of the game and then get into the bullpen and beat them up. And I felt that there needed to be someone who could help describe that. And Varitek was the perfect person, the Yankee-Red Sox rivalry. He was a rookie in 98. So as you described, I caught up with him at Yankee Stadium. And as Judge and Stanton were taking batting practice, I could just see Varitek's focus going back to that 98 team and saying, how do I stop Knobloch, Jeter, O'Neill, Bernie, Tino? You can't stop these guys. So I felt that scouting report was necessary. And as far as Homer Bush, it's interesting you bring him up. In another interview, somebody asked me who was the first person I interviewed for this book. And it was actually Homer Bush. And Homer would say this himself, I wanted to start with the reserves. I wanted to start with the backup players, get those guys, and then work my way up to the stars. So I had about an hour-long conversation with Homer Bush, and some of the anecdotes he told about being a fly on the wall for a big part of that season because he didn't play a lot. Some of his stories were tremendous.
Jack, just as you said, they became a juggernaut, 64 and 16 after that meeting, as you just mentioned. Everything is just going according to script. It's going perfectly. Late in the season, no one saw this coming, but Darryl Strawberry announces to the team that he has colon cancer, and it throws a black cloud over the team. Can you speak to that for a moment?
We were in Texas. The Yankees were playing in the division series, and Strawberry had left the team to go for tests. So his teammates knew that something was up, and the Yankees found out that he had colon cancer. And Mike, I've covered a lot of postseason workouts and practices. They're usually upbeat. The players are usually bubbly. And that day it was quiet. It was quiet in Texas because the players were absorbing the news that they got. I remember David Cohn's dad happened to be at the workout, and you saw Cohn seeking out his dad and kind of putting his head on his dad's shoulder. He and Straw were very close. He ended up pitching game 3 and getting the win for the Yankees. But yeah, Mike, life comes at you fast, and baseball players aren't immune from illness either. And Cohn, I thought, said it best. He talked about everything Darryl had conquered to get back to that point and be part of another potential championship team. And then to find out that he had colon cancer, I do think that hit the Yankees very hard. And as much as they wanted to win that series for themselves, I do think that they wanted to win it for Straw. And in San Diego, when they did win the World Series, they did have a chant about Strawberry. So they'd never forgot him throughout that entire October.
And they had that number 39 on the side of the cap and all of that. I loved the chapter "Mañana no problema," and again it gets back to El Duque and Jack. I can still see Tomei hitting that ball to right field. I thought it was out, and when Paul O'Neill goes back to the wall and catches it. But you want to know something? That was the one moment in time where the Yankees had to feel that what they accomplished actually had potential to be a negative, to be this weight that they did not want to be that team to win all of these games and then lose in the postseason.
Yeah, it was the most stressful moment of the season. That's the way I describe it. Game 4 of the ALCS. You're right. You don't want to win 114 games in the regular season and then lose in the postseason because you'll be forgotten. And we found that out a few years later. Seattle Mariners in 2001 won 116 games. No one talks about them when they talk about the best teams of all time because they didn't even get to the World Series. So El Duque was the perfect guy to have on the mound in that game. He was not someone who would ever be nervous. He was someone who would attack hitters, but attack them, Mike, in his way. He was going to make you follow his plan. And after that close call with Tomei, he just pitched great the rest of the way. And the Yankees never lost another postseason game the rest of the way. They ended up running the table. 3 straight against Cleveland, 4 straight against San Diego.
4 straight against San Diego, as you said. You were in the locker room in '98 again. Now this time it's a very different feeling. You're probably getting sprayed with champagne. Just briefly tell us, about that.
I just remember how it was a combination of joy, but also relief because of what we just talked about. That team knew that in order to be remembered and in order to validate its regular season, they had to win. So I saw guys celebrating, but I also saw guys taking deep breaths and exhaling and saying, okay, you did it. You did it. You got to this point. And as I said, I remember them chanting for Straw. They were chanting for Brocious. It was a really small clubhouse in San Diego, but it was quite the celebration.
Jack, when you were on MLB channel, Brian Kenny does a great job, and he asked you, like, to put it into context, and you mentioned that from '96 to 2001, the Yankees won 14 of 16 postseason series. I mean, that is amazing. And he asked you, what was the key to you in your eyes? And I believe that you mentioned it was just that the tenacity and the fire in their eyes and their constant tenacity. What is that? What your takeaway is for that whole kind of dynasty, if you will?
That's part of it, Mike. I think we always have to start with talent. We're always looking for other reasons beyond the fact that, hey, they had a lot of talent on the field, and they had a lot of players who were driven. And I thought Tino Martinez, getting back to the '98 team, told me something very interesting. And it wasn't just about the '98 team, but he said that you would go into the clubhouse, and I've been in hundreds of clubhouses, and there's always somebody sitting on the couch Back in '98, they would have been reading a newspaper or a magazine. These days, they'd have their phone or an iPad in their hand. And Tino said in '98, he never saw anybody doing that. Guys were working. And that's what I would say about that entire dynastic run. They were working. They knew how precious this time was. They were trying to build on what they had accomplished. And I think they wanted to make sure that they left as strong a legacy as possible.
Jack, if you will allow me, because and then we'll wrap it up, this way. But I'm having the opportunity to speak to you, and how many Yankee fans would love to be in my position right now. So if you would allow me to get on my soapbox for a minute, and then I want your feedback. One, I believe that no matter how much praise you give Mariano Rivera, it's not enough. In my opinion, 96 to 2000, if I had to say one player, I cannot even put the great Derek Jeter ahead of Mariano Rivera. I have to put them on the same level. And I'll tell you why. Yes Network put a graphic up at the beginning of the season. DeGrom was on the mound, and they said that in the history of baseball, in the live era, last 100 years, Mariano Rivera has the lowest ERA at 2.21 of any pitcher ever, okay, at 2.21. Now, just to put this into context, when you go into the postseason, ladies and gentlemen, take 2.21, pull out a calculator, divide that by 3. That's his postseason ERA. This, in my opinion, as great as Mariano Rivera is, and he was a first-time, unanimous, the only one, he's almost a little bit taken for granted, Jack. What other player can we say that had all-time numbers and then became 3 times greater in the postseason, in the steroid era, no less?
Yeah, he was the separator. And you look at some of the years where the Yankees did win in the World Series, and obviously he had the hiccup in '97. He's got the loss in 2001 to the Diamondbacks. But other than that, and the Red Sox later, he had a few hiccups, but he has a pristine postseason record. And I agree with you. Games are won and lost by what your bullpen has the ability to do. And David Justice, who played for the Braves and later won a World Series with the Yankees, said to me once that if they had Mariano when he was in Atlanta, he said they would have won 3 or 4 World Series, not just one. So I think you're right in talking about putting Mariano up on a mountaintop. That's how great he was.
Jack, what I also thought was so poignant, you started the book. You talked about your dad. Could you take a brief moment, if you will, if you'd be good enough, to tell us about your dad? And I think it would make a nice frame to, the Father's Day, upcoming.
Yeah, I can never talk about my father without talking about my mom. But I lost my mom in 1994. I lost my dad in 1995. So it's been a long time since I've been able to have a conversation with them. But I still hear them in my head every day. And I thought this book was one that should be dedicated to my dad. I also dedicated it to my father-in-law, who is still with us. And my father was one of my biggest supporters and gave me the ability to dream, to go and do what I wanted to do with my career. And one of the things I mentioned in the acknowledgement was I hope that I have as half the street smarts and half the wit that he had. And after my dad passed away, unbeknownst to me, he had big scrapbooks with filled with the articles that I've written for the New York Times. So I still have those, and I appreciate how supportive he and my mom were to what I was trying to do.
Yeah. It makes the perfect Father's Day book, ladies and gentlemen. You've given the tie, you've given the steaks. Okay, this is no cholesterol, and I guarantee you they'll love it. Jack, thank you so much for taking time. It's been an absolute pleasure for me, and I thank you so much. And I think the Yankee viewers will love this interview and look forward to putting it out on social media.
Thanks for having me on, Mike, and I look forward to our next conversation. Take care.
Thank you very much.